Hi, Jason Lodge here from the Institute for Teaching and Learning Innovation and the School of Education here at the University of Queensland. In this video, I want to talk a little bit about some ideas out there about how learning works and what that means for teaching and how they don't really line up with what we're understanding about the mechanisms of learning and what it actually looks like when we look a little bit closer at how these processes play out. The first of these ideas that we'll talk about is this idea that you can be left-brained or right-brained, and that would mean that you are either kind of logical if you're a left-brained person, or you're more creative if you're a right-brained person. So that's ideally what this myth is about, and there is at least a kernel of truth in this, in that we do have two hemispheres of our brain. Those hemispheres do slightly different things. If you're right-handed, for example, the left hemisphere takes care of more of the language types of things that the brain does. However, we know from the evidence that it's not a kind of global thing. So this idea that you're right-brained or left-brained is a bit of an oversimplification. There's a lot more complexity in it, and both hemispheres do elements of both the kind of creativity and logical side of things. So that one's a little bit of a myth. Along similar lines, we have this idea that students only use 10% of their brains, or that any of us only use 10% of our brains. So with this one, it's quite a popular one in Hollywood. You're probably familiar with several movies out there over the last 10 years that are built around this idea that we only use 10% of our brains, and then what would happen if somebody gave you a drug that would allow you to use all of it? It's not true in that there are several things that come into consideration here. One is that we tend to use all of our brains for various different things, so it's not as though 90% of our brain is sitting there unused. However, there are obviously limitations to what our brain can do and can handle. So there are only so many things that we can pay attention to, for example, and there are only so many things that we can work with in our short-term or working memory. So there are limitations there, but it's not as though we're only using 10% of our brain. That one's not quite right. Another idea that's out there that is not well supported by some of the research is this idea that our level of intelligence is somehow fixed, that it's a kind of hard-coded genetic component that contributes to how we progress through life. Now, genes do play a role, of course, and they're going to influence how intelligent we are or how we're able to perform in academic contexts or otherwise. However, it's not something that is fixed, and it is certainly something that can change over time with experience and certainly with education. So it's not as though it's fixed, and it is a sort of dangerous idea to think that we have this sort of set genetic potential and then that's going to influence how we progress for the rest of our lives. There is some element of that is genetic, but the environment has an enormous impact on that and will influence how we go academically or otherwise beyond that point. So flipping over a little bit more to the kind of teaching side of things, this idea about pure sort of discovery-based learning and how that might be the best approach. Now, this one's a little bit more tricky in that there is a component of this that is useful. If people need to be able to solve problems in the future, then getting practice and understanding that problem-solving process is obviously a really important thing to do. However, if we're talking simply about acquiring new ideas and acquiring knowledge, the evidence suggests that it's actually much better to have a more kind of direct instruction approach, which is that we're helping students more directly to learn rather than giving them a problem and expecting them to go away and solve it. So the key here is that there is a certain element of knowledge that's required in the first place before a kind of problem-solving process is really going to have maximum benefit. The next one is about how our memory works. And there is an idea there that our memory works by basically recording all of the experiences that we have exactly as we experience them in the world. However, it's not true for any of us. We don't record the world like it's some sort of video that we're taking as we go about our daily lives. So we don't capture everything. We can only pay attention to a certain amount of things that we experience in the world. And therefore, the sorts of things that actually get encoded into our long-term memory are not an accurate and complete recollection of everything that's going on in the environment. So there are limits here to what we can take in. There is also obviously then going to be an element of forgetting over time. Now, forgetting happens fairly reliably for most of us. We're not going to remember everything exactly as we experienced it because partly we only encoded some of it in the first place, and secondly because we will see that that memory will degrade over time, and eventually we end up remembering the last time we remembered. So you can see in some of the ideas that we've talked about already, they've got a sort of intuitive appeal. They have a sort of validity to them that makes sense on the surface and certainly gives a lot of fodder for Hollywood and other kinds of entertainment. However, when we dig a little bit deeper, it just turns out that those things don't necessarily align with what we understand about the evidence about how learning works or how our brains work. And it's really important that we do think about these things critically, because increasingly we understand how complex the brain and the mind are, and that means that some of the things that might be intuitively true are not necessarily true when we look at the evidence. So they might feel like a good way to learn or a good way to help students to learn, but they're not necessarily going to be the most effective ways to do it. With that in mind, let's have a look at the top 5 myths that are worth thinking about. The next one we're going to talk about is this idea that rereading and highlighting are really effective study strategies. So this one comes from the experience that many of us had, myself included, where I previously, when I was a student and I was learning, I did a lot of rereading and I had lots of different coloured highlighters. It can have some benefits, but it's not the best and most effective use of time when we're studying. What we've found in the research is that it's really more a case of trying to test the knowledge that you've got. So some sort of self-testing where you try and figure out whether you actually know the material as well as you do. Flashcards and other kinds of tools like that are much more effective because they're actually prompting you to use the knowledge that you've accumulated rather than going over what you have done previously. So there is a place for some of these kinds of strategies like rereading and highlighting. However, they're not the best use of time. The best use is to try and test your knowledge in some way, and that seems to be a much more effective way to study. Moving on to a technology idea here now, and in this instance, we're talking about this idea that laptops are necessarily bad for learning, or any mobile device is going to be detrimental to learning when it's added into any sort of learning equation. And this is quite a pervasive one. It gets a lot of media attention. We should be banning phones from classrooms and so on is something that we often hear. Now, it's much more complicated than that. Like a lot of these things, we know that there is going to be some element of distraction when you add technologies into a learning environment. However, a lot of that's going to be driven by whether or not those tools are actually incorporated into the learning or not. So it can have a detrimental effect to be using mobile devices and laptops. It can be detrimental for the student using it and for other students around them because it kind of multiplies the distraction effect in that regard. However, if we start to think more carefully about how we integrate those technologies into what we're doing in a classroom, then that distraction element will lessen and we will have a much more beneficial relationship to the technologies that will be really kind of useful to helping student learning. The next one we're going to talk about is this idea that if a student is engaged, that necessarily means that they're going to be learning something. So the idea here is that if we can get a sense of whether students are engaged in a learning activity, then by proxy, it means that they're going to be learning from that. Now, there are some really good examples out there about why we know this is not necessarily true, and you might have experienced this yourself. So one example of this is a really expensive, glossy documentary that they've spent millions of dollars on animations and other kinds of elements to make it super engaging. What we generally find with these sorts of tools and resources that are out there for learning is that they are absolutely engaging because of the amount of money and the really high production value that's put into these kinds of documentaries. We're really engaged with them. What tends to happen though is that if we ask people a day later, a week later, a month later about what they remember from that, it doesn't necessarily seem to line up with the level of engagement that we saw. So while it's important to be engaged and to see that learners and students are engaged in their learning, it's not necessarily the key element that contributes to learning. Engagement is important, but we also need to make sure that learning is happening apart from that. We can watch glossy documentaries, but we might not necessarily actually take the learning away from it. So there is a kind of balance between the level of engagement and how kind of entertaining something is and kind of maximising the benefit of the learning that occurs as a result of being exposed to that particular resource. Moving on to the next one, we're getting to the top 2 here. This idea is quite pervasive. We see this quite a lot reported in various different places. And this idea is that younger people who have grown up with the internet are digital natives. They know how to use technologies and they can use any kind of technology at any time. That might be true in some circumstances. So you can imagine that a young person is potentially better using certain social media sites that are 5-second dancing videos or finding cat videos where they're falling over or jumping around or whatever it may be. That doesn't necessarily mean that that same young person who is really great at using these kinds of online tools is necessarily going to maximise the benefits that they might get out of a learning management system or some sort of other digital learning environment that they might be in. So while some elements of the internet and technology and network devices might be really intuitive and might be something that young people are really used to, it's not transferable. The other issue is an equity issue here. We can't just assume that every student has had access to all of the kinds of technologies and tools that are out there. For many students, that's just not a reality, and they haven't grown up with the kind of exposure to computers and the internet that other students have. So it can be a little bit dangerous to assume that all students of a certain age are really going to be on top of how to use the kinds of technologies that we would use in education. The last one is a classic, and it's something that I've done some research on myself with some colleagues. This idea is that we need to develop learning that is catered for people who have preferences for different kinds of modalities. So you often hear things like, I'm a visual learner or I'm an auditory learner, and therefore I need my learning to be targeted at that particular sensory modality. And there's been an enormous amount of work that's been done on this. Some people who have made quite a lot of money out of some of the ideas. The evidence is accumulating that it just isn't the best way to think about how we can help students to learn. While we do have preferences in our learning, and that's true, some people prefer to read, some people prefer to listen or have podcasts and go through their learning that way. For a lot of other people, there might be a mix, and it's not about the match between the modality that somebody has a preference for and how we develop learning resources. The best way we can do it is by using an approach that is really about multimedia, and that is that auditory channels, visual channels support each other. It's about using the best of both modalities to try and reinforce each other. And that seems to be a much more effective way to think about how we use our different sensory modalities in learning, working together rather than targeting one or the other, which just doesn't seem to have the evidence to support as a viable approach. So we've gone through some ideas here that have been around for a while in a lot of cases that are about how learning supposedly works that don't really seem to match with the evidence. Now, if you believed any of these ideas, that's totally okay. So did I. Like I said, I used to do a lot of rereading and highlighting. I've had to change my mind about some of these things over time. As the evidence has accumulated, we're starting to understand more and more about the most effective ways that we might be able to help students. Now, that's not to say that we have a recipe or a formula. While we talk about these as myths and they're not necessarily the right way of thinking about it, they do make intuitive sense, and there's a really good reason why these ideas have floated around for so long, because they do kind of match up with some of our experience. But that's why it's really important for us to understand some of the fundamental evidence to see some of these disconnects between that evidence and what we might see in a classroom, and then come to some understanding about what that might mean in terms of the way that we might use that evidence to enhance how our students learn. So hopefully you found that interesting, and we look forward to seeing you think differently about the way that you're teaching. Thanks.